She set it in the kitchen, standing between the counter and her phone, like she was reading a policy out loud. Intimacy wasn't a priority. Not right now. Too much stress. Too many responsibilities. The words landed clean and final, like something already approved by a committee. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. This wasn't a discussion. It was a boundary she expected me to step back from without making noise. I didn't argue. I didn't ask when things would change. I nodded, rinsed my coffee mug, and went to work like nothing had shifted. That silence confused her more than any protest would have. She was used to managing reactions. She worked in HR, access, limits, approvals. She knew how to close a door and still keep control of the room. That evening, we met friends for drinks. Familiar faces. Familiar laughter. Her hand rested lightly on my arm when others were watching. Across the table sat Mark, my best friend. The guy who had keys to our house, who knew our schedules, who talked real estate and market swings with me like we were still building something side by side. I noticed the look she gave him. Not long. Not obvious. Just practiced enough to slip past anyone who wasn't looking for it. Mark smiled back, easy and comfortable, like this was all normal. I stayed quiet. Engineers are trained to observe systems before touching them. And that night, I saw something misaligned. Not broken, just rerouted. Whatever intimacy wasn't a priority for me had clearly been reassigned. The first real shift came from someone who wasn't supposed to matter. It happened at work, during a routine site review. One of the junior engineers mentioned Mark in passing, laughing about how he'd helped a mutual friend find a condo near the river. The way he said it wasn't strange. The detail that followed was. He mentioned my house. Not the address. The layout. The spare room. Things I'd only ever talked about at home. I didn't react. I finished the walkthrough, signed off on the plans, drove back to the office. Precision comes from not rushing conclusions. Still, the system in my head started recalculating. That evening, my wife came home later than usual. She said it was work. A long meeting. HR stuff. She said it without urgency, without expectation that I'd question it. She moved through the house like everything was settled. Like my role had already been reduced to background stability. Dinner stayed untouched on the stove. She took a shower. Her phone stayed face down on the counter, lighting up now and then with notifications she didn't rush to check. Later, while she slept, I sat in the dark living room and replayed small things I'd dismissed for months. Weekend errands that didn't need company. Sudden interest in fitness. New clothes that weren't meant for me to notice. Mark stopping by when I wasn't home. Mark knowing things before I told him. There was no anger yet. Just alignment. The pieces fit too cleanly to ignore. Whatever she'd decided wasn't a priority in our marriage hadn't disappeared. It had been redirected. And the people involved were closer than I wanted to believe. I didn't confront anyone. I adjusted my routine instead. The next morning, I left earlier than usual and came back later. Not to avoid her, but to watch what filled the gaps. Patterns show themselves when pressure changes. I checked the shared calendar she managed so carefully. Meetings appeared and disappeared. Blocks of time labeled vaguely, like placeholders. I didn't question them. I mirrored the behavior. I stopped announcing where I was going. She didn't notice. Or she did and assumed control still sat with her. The evidence didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A receipt in the car for gas across town, nowhere near her office. A property listing text that popped up on the tablet we both used, quickly dismissed, but not before I saw Mark's name. A bank alert for a restaurant charge she'd never taken me to, not once in 10 years. I stood in the hallway one evening while she talked on the phone in the bedroom. Her voice was lower than usual. Measured. Familiar in a way it hadn't been with me for a long time. When she noticed me, the call ended immediately. She smiled, asked about my day, and went back to scrolling like nothing had happened. I didn't accuse. I didn't flinch. I started moving assets quietly. Opened a separate account. Redirected part of my income. Updated documents that hadn't been touched since we first married. Not out of panic. Out of sequence. She thought the marriage was stable because it was quiet. She mistook silence for compliance. She didn't see that the system she depended on was already being dismantled, one unnoticed adjustment at a time. The night she said, "Not tonight," again, nothing in her tone suggested it was temporary. She didn't even turn toward me. She reached for her phone, already moving on, already certain the answer required no follow-up. I stood there long enough for her to feel the absence of my response. She didn't look up. The next morning, I didn't follow the usual route. I didn't go to the office first. I drove across town and signed a short-term lease I'd already reviewed days earlier. Clean place. Neutral. No photos on the walls. I forwarded part of my mail. I separated accounts fully. Quiet transactions. No alerts that would draw attention. By the time she got home that evening, the house felt different. Not empty. Disconnected. My closet had space in it. The garage had one less car. The shared tablet was gone. She stood in the hallway longer than usual, scrolling, checking notifications, waiting for something to make sense. I didn't block her number. I just didn't answer right away. Hours passed between responses. Then a day. Then longer. When I did reply, it was short. Informational. No tension. No questions. She started showing up where she expected to find me. The gym. The coffee place near my office. I adjusted again. New times. New routes. Familiar faces noticed before she did. She asked if something was wrong. I said everything was handled. That was when control slipped. Not loudly. Not publicly. Just enough for her to feel it. The structure she relied on was still there. It just no longer responded to her access. Mark didn't expect me to notice him pulling away first. He stopped texting. Stopped calling. When we ran into each other, he acted casual, like distance had always been there. That told me everything I needed to know. People don't withdraw unless they're protecting something. I didn't approach him directly. I watched. Realtors live on reputation and timing. They depend on access, introductions, quiet trust. I started listening more carefully when his name came up. Not pushing, just present. Patterns surfaced fast when no one felt threatened. A delayed closing here. A client suddenly unavailable there. A few conversations where his confidence slipped, just enough. I didn't interfere. I didn't warn. I passed along information the way professionals do, neutrally, without ownership. Things he assumed were secure began to wobble under their own weight. At the same time, my wife grew restless. She checked her phone constantly now. She asked questions she hadn't asked in years. Where I was staying. Whether we should talk. Whether something had changed. I kept my answers steady. Nothing emotional. Nothing reactive. She started arriving home earlier. Dressing differently. Watching me when we crossed paths, like she was trying to recalibrate a system that no longer followed her input. Mark wasn't showing up as often. When he did, the ease was gone. The comfort between them had fractured under pressure neither of them saw coming. I didn't enjoy any of it. That surprised me most. This wasn't revenge. It was alignment. Systems correct themselves when dependencies are removed. I had simply stepped out of the structure they were leaning on and let gravity handle the rest. The shift became visible at a small gathering she insisted on attending together. Friends, co-workers, familiar faces who had known us as a unit for years. I arrived separately. I stayed near the edges. Observed. She noticed immediately. Her smile worked harder than usual, like it was covering for missing support. People asked where I'd been. I answered politely, briefly. Work. Projects. Nothing dramatic. The absence of details did more than explanations ever could. Conversations drifted. Eyes followed. She tried to pull me back into place with proximity, with touches meant for an audience. I didn't resist. I also didn't respond. Mark showed up late. He didn't approach us together. He kept his distance, spoke mostly to others, laughed louder than necessary. The triangle everyone had sensed but never named started to collapse under its own weight. No one accused. No one confronted. That's what made it worse. A friend of hers mentioned, casually, that things seemed different. Another asked if we were traveling separately now. Someone joked about independence. She laughed, but it came out thin. Control depends on shared perception. That night, perception slipped out of her hands. I left early. No announcement. Just absence. She followed shortly after. Messages came in fast once she realized I wasn't waiting. Questions. Suggestions. Attempts to reset the tone. I responded later with a neutral acknowledgement. The next morning, she reached out to mutual friends before she reached out to me. That told me she felt the shift too. Not betrayal. Exposure. She wasn't being pushed out. She was being left behind, publicly, without a scene. And everyone could see it. After that night, the house stopped being a refuge for her. I could feel it in the way she lingered at the door when I came by to pick up remaining documents. She filled the space with movement, Noise, small talk that went nowhere. I stayed focused, collected what I needed, left without ceremony. She started reaching out more often. Not confrontational. Careful. Messages framed like check-ins, like concern. She asked if I was eating, if work was overwhelming, if I needed anything. The tone wasn't affection. It was uncertainty. She had lost her reference point. Mark faded almost completely. When his name surfaced among friends, it came with hesitation. A deal that fell through. A client who chose someone else. He stopped being the easy presence he'd always been. Whatever confidence he'd borrowed from secrecy didn't survive daylight. She tried to anchor herself socially. More lunches, more calls, more effort. But people respond to alignment, not performance. Without me beside her, things didn't land the same. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. She noticed. One evening, she showed up at my place unannounced. She stood outside longer than necessary before knocking, like she was bracing for a version of me she no longer recognized. When I opened the door, I didn't block her. I also didn't invite her in right away. That pause unsettled her more than anger would have. She spoke carefully, asked where we stood. I listened without correcting her assumptions. When she finished, there was nothing to add. I closed the door gently after she left. That was when the isolation set in. Not dramatic, not loud. Just the quiet realization that the structure she managed so well no longer included her at the center. She asked to meet a few days later, choosing a neutral place like it would level the ground between us. I arrived on time, sat where I could see the entrance. Old habits don't disappear, they just change purpose. She came in tense, scanning first, then settling across from me. Her hands stayed busy. Phone, cup, sleeve. She spoke about confusion, about distance, about how fast everything had shifted. She said she didn't recognize the version of me sitting there. That part was true. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct the timeline she built out loud. She framed things as misunderstandings, stress, misalignment. She avoided names, avoided specifics. The absence of them said enough. When she paused, waiting for reassurance, I stayed still. No nodding, no softening, just presence without engagement. That silence forced her to keep talking. She filled it with explanations that contradicted each other, with references to effort she'd only started making once access was gone. She asked if there was someone else. I shook my head once. Not defensively, just factually. That unsettled her more than denial would have. She expected competition, something she could manage. I told her I'd made changes that worked for me. Nothing more. No accusations. No history lesson. She pressed for clarity. I stood up instead. As I left, she stayed seated, watching me go like she was trying to memorize the angle of my back. That was the moment she understood I wasn't negotiating. I had already exited the structure she was still trying to repair. The fallout didn't explode. It thinned out. That was worse for her. Mark stopped being mentioned altogether. Not by me, by everyone else. His name fell out of conversations like it had never belonged there. When it did surface, it came attached to hesitation, to lowered voices, to details that didn't quite add up anymore. Whatever confidence had held him upright collapsed once secrecy was no longer protected by proximity to me. My wife unraveled more slowly. She missed meetings, forgot things she never used to forget. The composure she built her career on started slipping in small, visible ways. People noticed. Not enough to intervene, just enough to step back. She reached out less to me and more to the past. Old photos, old messages, familiar routines she'd dismissed when they were still available. She tried to reinsert herself where she'd once been central. The response was polite, distant, temporary. I heard about it indirectly. Mutual friends, shared acquaintances, not gossip, observation. She wasn't being pushed away. She was being met with neutrality. No one knew how to place her without me beside her, anchoring the narrative. I stayed out of it. My days were structured now, predictable in a way that felt earned. New apartment, clean mornings, work that stayed at work, evenings without waiting for permission or approval. When she finally reached out again, it wasn't to argue or explain. It was to say she felt alone, that she hadn't realized how much I carried until it was gone. I read the message once. Didn't reply right away. Some systems don't fail loudly. They simply stop supporting weight. And by then, her collapse had nothing left to do with me. We met one last time because logistics required it, not emotion. Paperwork, signatures, neutral ground again. She arrived early. I arrived on time. The balance mattered. She looked different. Not broken. Stripped down. No performance left. She didn't reach for me this time. Didn't manage the space. She waited. When she spoke, it wasn't layered or strategic. She said she finally understood what she dismantled while assuming it would stay standing. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked if there was still a way back. I listened. Not as her husband. Not as her anchor. Just as someone who no longer owed emotional labor. When she finished, the room stayed quiet longer than she expected. That silence wasn't punishment. It was clarity. I told her I wasn't angry. That surprised her more than anything else. I said I had stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. That I'd built a life that didn't require convincing anyone of my value. I didn't accuse her of betrayal. I didn't mention Mark. There was no need. The absence of those names carried more weight than confrontation ever could. She asked what that meant for us. I stood, gathered my things, and told her the truth. That if there was ever going to be anything again, it wouldn't look like before. It wouldn't run on convenience or control. It would require effort she'd never had to give. Then I left. I didn't disappear. I just stopped standing in places where I was optional. And this time, I didn't look back to see if she understood. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.